Hey, good evening. Welcome to a celebration of Nantucket Sound, or ACONS as we call it, our free educational webinar series as we are coming very close to the end of July already. My name is Peter Aramo. I am the Communications Director at the Alliance. For those of you who do not know us, the Alliance is a nonprofit environmental organization. We're based in Hyannis on Cape Cod. Our mission is the permanent protection and preservation of Nantucket Sound. That's the body of water that lies between Cape Cod and the islands of Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard. This is especially important. I'm going to share a screen here. This is especially important. There we go. Although it's one ecosystem, it is split between federal jurisdiction and state jurisdiction. You have the federal waters right there in the center of Nantucket Sound, and those are surrounded by state waters. They run 3 miles from the coastline of Cape Cod and the islands. The state waters are part of the Massachusetts Ocean Sanctuary System, and they are protected, but the federal waters, they remain open and vulnerable to future development. So you may be aware that early last year, the current administration issued a temporary withdrawal of areas from offshore wind leasing. Now, this directive, it does include the federal waters of Nantucket Sound, but it is only a temporary measure, and it could easily be reversed by the current or future administrations. So our mission to permanently protect and preserve Nantucket Sound remains as important as ever. The Alliance embarked on significant community outreach to determine, well, what's the best type of permanent protection for this special body of water, and have for the last few years, we've been pursuing a National Historic Landmark designation for all of Nantucket Sound. A National Historic Landmark designation is, in fact, the highest level of protection possible. So this designation, it would recognize the sound as a sacred tribal site. It would protect traditional uses like fishing and recreation and preserve this body of water in perpetuity. Throughout this process, we've built a very large and diverse coalition of support with nearly 100 stakeholder groups on board. We have municipalities all along the shores of the Cape and Islands. We have historic preservation groups, chambers of commerce, tribal entities, environmental organizations, and many others that represent literally hundreds of thousands of individuals. In order to build support to permanently protect the sound, we have been spreading awareness as to what makes the sound so special. And we've been hosting this webinar series since 2020. In fact, in September, it will have been 6 years, and they've been very popular. And I certainly learned something, and I'm going to learn more even tonight. I learned something from each and every one. I'm excited about it. I'm thrilled that we're going to be hitting our 6-month anniversary, our 6-year anniversary, but it's really to celebrate the Sound's historic, cultural, environmental, and and economic significance. So this evening, I'm happy to welcome Karen Beattie. She's with the Nantucket Conservation Foundation, and Karen's going to share with us the remarkable transformation of the Windswept Bog, and we'll learn how projects like this not only benefit local ecosystems, but also strengthen coastal resilience and help protect the waters, Nantucket Harbor and Nantucket Sound. So I'll give a little bit about Karen, and then I will hand over the floor to her. Hi, Karen. She is the
Hello.
Hi. She is the Vice President of Science and Stewardship for the Nantucket Conservation Foundation, and they are a private nonprofit land trust that own, protect, and steward over 9,000 acres of conservation land on Nantucket Island. And she holds a degree in biological sciences from the State University of New York at Stony Brook Island, and a master's degree in wildlife management from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. She's worked at the Nantucket Conservation Foundation since 1992. She oversees the Restoration Ecology Program of their Department of Ecological Research, Stewardship, and Restoration. And the department focuses on research aimed at informing the restoration and stewardship of rare resources on Nantucket Conservation Foundation's properties. So I'm going to jump off. Karen's going to give her presentation. If you have questions, put them in the Q&A, and we'll definitely get to all the Q&As. We'll have that segment after Karen gives her presentation. I'll hop back on then. So feel free to write in your questions at any time. And hey, Karen, good to see you.
Hello. Good to
Hey.
see you too. I'm just going to start sharing my screen.
It looks great. Thank you. I'm gonna hop off. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and I'll see you in a little bit.
Great. Can you see this and everything look okay?
Looks great.
Great. Thank you. Well, I'm very excited to be here tonight to talk to you about a cranberry bog wetland restoration project that the Nantucket Conservation Foundation undertook at Windswept Bog on Nantucket Island. And I want to talk particularly about how this restoration, the implications for this restoration has to coastal connections and water quality. So, Peter, thank you for giving a really great introduction to my organization, NCF. As Peter said, we're a private nonprofit land trust. We own about 9,000 acres on Nantucket. That's about the 1/3 of the land area on Nantucket Island. So we are primarily involved in land protection and conservation, protection of the properties that we own, but we also have a year-round education department. We have an active land stewardship department, and then we have an ecological research department that does targeted research to inform our restoration work. And so the project that I'm going to talk about today is a really good example of that. I'm sure this audience is very familiar with where Nantucket is in relation to New England, but this map of the island shows in green the properties that the Conservation Foundation has protected, permanently protected. And the site that we're going to talk about tonight is Windswept Bog, which is in the northeastern part of the island, shown in the white circle. So I wanted to talk a little bit about cranberry growing in both Massachusetts and in particular on Nantucket Island. I'm sure most people are probably familiar with the fact that southeastern Massachusetts is a really important area. It's cranberry country, pretty much, for growing cranberries, and this is a really important part of the economy of this region. Cranberries are actually a native plant to North America, and they're a northern associated species, so they like cold winters and not so warm summers. And they were a really important food crop for Native Americans who harvested them for food and then also medicines and dyes. They were also important to the settlers that first came here in the early 1600s. And this is pretty much ground zero, Cape Cod at least is ground zero for where commercial cultivation was developed for cranberries. Right on the Cape, that's where they figured out how to cultivate them as an agricultural crop. So this has been a big economic driver for Massachusetts in general, but on Nantucket in particular, it was really important given our history. We had a great fire in 1846, which destroyed half of our downtown area. And I think most people know that Nantucket is known for the whaling industry. The whaling industry declined very soon after the fire happened and moved to New Bedford, and then petered out pretty much altogether with the discovery of petroleum. And so it's hard to believe this now, but Nantucket was actually a very economically challenging place to make a living in the mid 1800s. And we have very nutrient poor sandy soils, so regular crop growing isn't very good with the conditions that we have here. So the islanders turned to growing cranberries, and this was a way to kind of get through some really lean economic times on the island before our tourism industry took off, and it has become what it is today and what we are primarily known for. By 1980, there were two remaining sites on Nantucket that were still cultivated for cranberries, Milestone and Windswept Cranberry Bogs, and both of those bogs are currently owned by the Nantucket Conservation Foundation. So just to kind of compare and contrast these two sites, Milestone Bog is a natural bog that was cultivated in 1857, so it's extremely historic. And it encompasses about 240 acres that were formerly cultivated, so it's a very, very large bog. It was once actually the largest contiguous cranberry bog in the world before dikes and other things were put in to divide it up for water conservation. And it's been farmed by three generations of the Larrabee family for over 70 years. And Nick Larrabee, the third generation, is actually still working for us and still growing cranberries. And we are still growing cranberries at Milestone Bog. We have about 25 acres that are still cultivated there. And we're continuing to grow cranberries for as long as we can because it is such an important part of the history of Nantucket. Windswept Bog, on the other hand, is located in the northeastern part of the island, and there actually is a direct connection to Nantucket Harbor at Windswept Bog. And that's something I'm going to touch on later in the presentation. This bog was constructed in the early 1900s, so it wasn't a bog to begin with. It was constructed, and it was much smaller. It contained only about 40 acres of contains only 40 acres of formerly cultivated bogs. So a little bit about the Windswept site that I'm going to be talking about today. The property was purchased by NCF in 1980, and we did continue to grow cranberries here for quite a while. It contains 40 acres of bogs that were divided into 14 individual bog cells. And those bog cells are very flat, dry, planted surfaces that are interspersed with drainage ditches. A lot of people confuse cranberry growing with the pictures that are commonly shown by Ocean Spray with people standing in the water wearing waders. Water is used to harvest cranberries, but for the most part, cranberries are grown, don't like to be immersed in water, and so they're grown on these very flat, dry surfaces. And the 1918 picture on this slide is good representation of what a cranberry bog actually looks like. At Windswept, the areas that were cranberry bogs with the numbers on them are shown in pink here in this map. And then the areas that are highlighted in green surrounding the bogs are naturally occurring wetlands that are adjacent to the bog cells. And that's an important point that will come up later in the presentation. And then interspersed among the bog cells are 81 acres of uplands. And so NCF made a decision to retire cranberry cultivation at Windswept Bog in 2017. And that was a decision that was made by our Board of Trustees. And I wanted to just talk a little bit about the reasons for that. They were both local reasons and then regional reasons that are being experienced by most people in Massachusetts who are growing cranberries. At Windswept, we were concerned about water quality. There is a single culvert that leaves the property and exits and heads eventually to connect to Pulpus Harbor, which is an embayment of Nantucket Harbor. And so while we were growing cranberries at this site, even though we were growing them organically, organic farming is still farming, organic fertilizer is still fertilizer. So we were being careful, but we were still contributing to the water quality problem. And we wanted to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. So that was one of the reasons why we made this decision to retire the bogs. More broadly across the region, climate change has really impacted the ability of people to grow cranberries in Massachusetts. Massachusetts used to be kind of in the middle of the natural range of cranberries, and now because of our hotter summers and our warmer winters, we're actually at the southern end of the range, and it's becoming more and more challenging to grow cranberries because there are new insect pests, there are more issues with fungus, and also a major factor is the fact that Canada, very smartly, has kind of gotten into the cranberry industry because they realize that the conditions are actually getting better to grow cranberries in Canada. So they have invested in newer bogs with better growing conditions. And in Canada, cranberry growing is subsidized by the Canadian government. So all of this has come together to decrease crop values and increase production costs for cranberries. And there are many people in southeastern Massachusetts that are making decisions similar to the decision that we made to retire their bogs and figure out something else to do with that property. And so the question that people need to kind of think about when they decide they don't want to grow cranberries anymore is, do they want to do a restoration project or do they just want to let nature take its course? And what has been found in cranberry bogs is that if you let nature take its course, what happens naturally if you don't do anything is that cranberry bogs very often turn into upland habitats. And the reason for that is that part of the practice of growing cranberries involves sanding in the winter. And when the bogs are flooded to protect the vines from freezing in the winter, there is a thin layer of sand that gets deposited on top of that ice when you can drive on it with a vehicle such as you can see here in this picture. And what that sand does is when it melts in the spring, it settles on the surface of the vines and it stimulates them to grow and produce uprights and to make more berries. And so this is a common practice, and most of the time it happens every year. And when you think about a cranberry bog such as Windswept that has been in existence for since the 1900s, that sand layer builds up, and you can see it actually in the picture with the tape measure here, where you see all the different layers. And what happens is that over time, the surface of the bog actually becomes further and further and further away from the groundwater and the wetland below it. And so when you don't grow cranberries there anymore, you get things like pitch pine moving in, which is an upland species, poison ivy, grapevines, things like that. And then the drainage ditches are still there, so those sites become ideal conditions for breeding mosquitoes. So abandoned cranberry bogs that are just left to their own are not ecologically valuable habitats. And what you wind up with is the loss of the wetland ecosystem services. And that is just a fancy term for explaining all the good things that wetlands do for the environment, including water quality improvement, flood storage, and fish and wildlife habitat. So we made a decision that we wanted to do an ecological restoration project at Windswept, a restoration project at Windswept. And so I wanted to put this up. This is the definition, the technical definition of ecological restoration. And it is assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that's been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. And when I say assisting the recovery, what we're talking about is basically just allowing that ecosystem to become what it once was. We're not trying to turn it into something that it never was. We're not going to turn it into something completely different. We just want to create the appropriate conditions to essentially allow nature to heal itself. So one of the first things that you need to do in order to design a wetland restoration project is you really need to do a deep dive to understand how your entire ecosystem works. It's really tempting to want to just do an exciting project and go out there and start putting shovels in the ground immediately, but you need to really understand the site and understand what's happening before you can design a project such as this. So we spent quite a few years learning about our site and the different ecological processes that were happening there, identifying stressors or things that were limiting this site from turning back into what it had been before. And then we had to plan and implement the restoration actions that could potentially relieve those ecological stressors. And then once you set the stage like that, you basically let Mother Nature and Father Time take it from there, and hope for the best. So the first thing we needed to do at Windswept Bog was we needed to determine what was there before it was a cranberry bog. And we didn't have any aerial photographs back in the early 1900s, so we couldn't look at those. But when we looked at the USGS topo maps, we saw that the area was called spots of swamp. So that was a really good indication that there had been a wetland there at this site before. So we did a ground penetrating radar survey, and that is exactly what it sounds like. You use radar to kind of give you an indication of what is underneath the surface that you can't see. And what we found is 2 to 14 feet of underlying peat. And peat is basically wetland soil that has been buried. And so that confirmed that there were, in fact, historic wetlands at this site before it was developed into a cranberry bog. And that enabled us to work with the Massachusetts Division of Ecological Restoration's Cranberry Bog Program. And this is a state program that has been put into effect to help landowners do exactly what we were doing, trying to figure out what to restore their properties to once they had made the decision to no longer grow cranberries. And I just want to give a really big shout out to Mass DER and our colleagues there. They were amazing partners to work with and supported us with both technical services and funding to get this project done. So Windswept was accepted as what's known as a priority project by Mass DER in 2021, and we are one of about 20 different projects across the Southeast region that either is in the design phase, the permitting phase, the construction phase, or has been completed to try to restore naturally occurring wetlands to sites that used to be cranberry bogs. So I want to very, very simply kind of describe exactly how you restore a cranberry bog. And it's all about relieving the ecological stressors that I mentioned earlier and restoring connections between the different wetlands. As I mentioned, at Windswept, we had 14 individual bog cells. They were all separated from each other, and they were all separated from the adjacent wetlands that were next to them. So it was really important for us to remove the dikes, the berms, the water control structures, so that the water could move more naturally and freely across the property rather than having to go from bog to bog with water control structures that needed to be manually opened. The next thing is removing that sand layer that I was talking about. You want to be able to reduce the elevation within the bogs, and you want to be able to reconnect with the groundwater, because that's basically a definition of a wetland, is it's a habitat that connects with groundwater. That sand is used to fill the ditches to reduce channelization, as you can see in this picture with the ditch. You know, long, straight, narrow ditches are not natural at all. We don't actually have any streams on Nantucket, yet alone straight streams like this. So you want to use that sand that you remove from the bog to fill in those ditches to reduce channelization and to create natural topography. And then finally, once you encounter that peat layer that's underneath the sand, you want to roughen the surface of that, because basically what that does is it exposes the wetland seed bank. And to me, this is one of the most remarkable things about doing a project such as this. In that peat are seeds that have been preserved, that are sort of remnants of when this site was a wetland 120 years ago, and they're still viable. And all you need to do is expose them and give them a day in the sun, and they come back on their own. And I'll show you some pictures of what that looks like later in the presentation. So this is a depiction of how those restoration actions were implemented at Windswept. Water basically moves from the right or east side of the property through the property and exits out the left. The pink areas are the individual bog cells that are separated from each other, and the green are the natural wetlands around the site, which are separated from the bog cells. So we want to remove those water control structures, take the sand layer off, create some topography, fill in the ditches, and then remove the berms that separate the cranberry bogs from the adjacent naturally occurring wetlands. So I want to spend some time talking about research and monitoring that our department did, which was pretty integral to informing the project construction phasing decisions. Windswept is a little bit unique in that it is the first cranberry bog restoration that was done in Massachusetts, where construction was purposefully phased to minimize impacts to rare plants and wildlife. We only did construction during the winter. Most of the time when you do a project like this, you start up and you just keep going until you're done. But we made a conscious decision to only do this construction work during the winter. The first phase happened in January through March of 2024, and then we took a break over the summer, and then we did phase two in the following year, November of 2024 to March of 2025, and completed the project in April of 2025. So I want to spend a little time talking about why we did that and what the benefits were to the ecological resources on the property. So we spent a lot of time, and when I say we, this was a big collective effort in our ecology department. All of our ecologists took part in all the work that I'm describing here. It was a true team effort. We did a lot of research and monitoring that informed the restoration design and the construction timing. We did a site-wide plant species list, which documented that we had numerous rare plants at the site. We documented vegetation communities that were already present, including sampling grasslands and wet meadows. And we wanted to understand habitat use by rare wildlife on the property, in particular spotted turtles, which we knew occurred there. So this is Kelly, our botanist, and she did a property-wide botanic inventory and documented over 400 species of plants on the property, which is quite a lot. That included native plants, introduced plants, invasive species, which that was really important for us to find them and manage them before we moved all this dirt around and inadvertently spread them across the site, and also quite a few rare and endangered plants. And one of the really interesting things we found by doing this study is that we documented that during farming, the bog borders, and this is a common practice, bog borders are purposefully maintained as lawns. They are, whoops, I just hit my, you see my screen still?
Now it looks like the Beatles album.
It looks like what?
It's white.
Oh,
There
there
you
we go.
go.
Is that better?
Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay, sorry, I just hit my keyboard. I'll
No,
keep
we're
my
all
hands
good.
to myself from now on. What we found is that during cultivation, when cranberries are grown, the edges of the bogs are mowed and basically treated like lawns. You want to keep that vegetation really, really low. You don't want those upland plants to go to seed and flower and seed and then have those seeds blow into the bog because you're trying to cultivate the bog to grow only one particular type of plant. But once we stopped growing cranberries at this site, what we found was that all by itself, these habitats, once we stopped the mowing, kind of turned into really diverse, ecologically valuable habitats, including sandplain grasslands and wet meadow habitats, and that there already were quite a few rare plant species on the property. So it was really important for us to know that before we went in and did a lot of destructive construction work. So we are a member of the Sandplain Grassland Network, the Nantucket Conservation Foundation is, and I believe that my colleague at the Linda Loring Nature Foundation on Nantucket, Sarah Boyce, has spoken to your group in the past about our diverse grasslands that we have, Sandplain grasslands. And this group is working actively with the Massachusetts Division of Ecological Restoration to encourage people who are doing cranberry bog restorations to consider trying to establish and restore sandplain grassland habitat in the uplands next to the bogs that are being restored. So the sand that comes out of the bog can actually be placed in what's called deposition areas, which are ideal restoration sites. And we are doing that at Windswept and placing that sand strategically adjacent to sites where we already have really great sandplain grassland habitat. And then that existing habitat can serve as a seed source for colonizing those sandy sites. And then we're also augmenting by adding locally collected seed and some plugs of native species that we are growing out in our greenhouse. Wet meadows are another cool habitat that we discovered on the property, and these are grasslands, just like the sandplain grasslands, but they're just a couple of inches lower in elevation, and that little bit of gradient creates standing water that's there for just a small portion of the year. So the plant species are very different. There are like sundews and orchids. They're very, very beautiful, and so those sites came back on their own after the mowing was ceased, and all we really needed to do was inventory them, understand them, know where they were, and then protect them during construction. So they were excluded from having sand placed on them. We had protective fencing on surrounding them during construction. Excuse me. And then going forward, we are managing them by mowing only during the dormant winter season to prevent shrub encroachment, and we're only doing that every couple of years. And that management strategy has proven to be very effective so far. So I mentioned spotted turtles. This is a threatened, endangered, or vulnerable species throughout much of its range, and we knew that we had turtles on the site, and in this entire corner of Nantucket Island there are a lot of spotted turtles. And so our goals here were to collect baseline data to determine their population status and document how they were using the site to inform the design of the project and the timing of when we were going to do the construction. So in order to do that, we trapped turtles within and around the bogs before restoration, during restoration, and then following restoration. We uniquely marked all of the turtles that we captured. And then we used radio transmitters on a subset of turtles to track their movement patterns over the course of a season and then into their hibernation locations the following winter. And this is really interesting, cool research that an entire presentation could be devoted to, but we don't have time for that. So I'm going to go through this really quickly and just kind of highlight the key findings that we found. These are locations where turtles were initially captured. And as you can see, most of the turtles were captured in the bogs, but some of them were captured in those wetlands that are surrounding the bog cells. And in total, we captured 272 individual turtles. These are radio tracking relocations. So essentially, once a turtle has a transmitter on it, then every 2 or 3 days, we go out and we re-find it and we document where it was. We don't pick it up and move it or anything. We just document how it's moving across the property. And you can see from this map that the turtles that with the transmitters on them are actively moving through the bogs, but they're also spending quite a bit of time in the wetlands that surround the bogs. And then for a small group of turtles, 24 turtles, we were able to track them to their winter hibernation sites. And most of those turtles, almost all of them, with the exception of 4, moved into the adjacent wooded shrub swamps in the winter, and that's where they hibernated. And we had only 4 that hibernated in ditches, and they hibernated in one particular bog, none of the other bogs. So that basically led us to the decision to phase this project so that we could do the construction only during the winter when we knew that most of the turtles were hibernating in the adjacent wetlands. And yeah, so I just kind of wanted to show this map again just to explain how we phased the project and how it was done during only the winter in 2024 and 2025. And all the reason for doing that was really just to protect the rare plants and the wildlife that we had documented on the property, and that was very important to us as a conservation organization. And we are conducting monitoring post-restoration to determine how the vegetation is responding and how the spotted turtles have survived. And we are very, very happy in that we are recapturing a lot of turtles that were marked before we did the restoration project. So we know that they actually survived. And now they're using all of the wetlands across the property, which is really neat. So I wanted to show some pictures before and after restoration so you can get a feel for what things are like on the ground when you do a project such as this. This is drone photography of what the site looked like immediately before restoration. This is January of 2024. And then this is what the site looks like now. This is post-restoration. This picture was only taken a couple of weeks ago. And what you can see here is that we have deeper pockets of water in the center of the former bog cells. And then the topography gradually grades out to the edges of the bog cells and gently grades into the surrounding uplands. And there's a lot of variation across the site, whereas before it was pretty much just a monoculture. Affiliated with growing cranberries. So this is kind of a depiction of what it looks like when you're doing this type of restoration work. It's very messy, but I will admit that it's really fun. It was cool to see this in process, and it was really interesting to see how all of the work we did to plan the project was in turn implemented by the contractors that we hired to do the job. And I just want to say we had a dream team of people that we worked with, Sumco Eco-Engineering. They were fantastic, as well as Fuss and O'Neill, the engineers that designed our plans for us. So I want to show you some before and after pictures. This is Bog 9, and this is immediately after the restoration work was completed. This is in July of the same year. So this is literally like 3 months later. And the thing I want to highlight here, what you're looking at, all of the green that you see here is from the soil seed bank that was exposed when we did that construction that had been stored in the peat for all those years. And then this is what the site looked like last summer. And it's holding water and looking just like a wetland should. This is on the other side of the property, the east side of the property, again, immediately following restoration, just a couple of months later, and then the following year. And then just one more on the western side of the property. And one of the things we were really pleased with, I know Cape Cod has been experienced drought for the last couple of years. We've had very, very droughty conditions here on Nantucket, but in spite of all that, we have been able to maintain the open water in these wetlands, which indicates that we were able to successfully connect with the groundwater and recreate a wetland. So I'm sure a lot of your audience are probably wondering, well, this is all nice, but what does this have to do with Nantucket Sound and why am I hearing this? So one of the things we found when we were getting ready to do this project and understanding the site is that Windswept is in fact a watershed. And as we were looking at the site and trying to figure out where water was coming from and where water was going, what we found is that this road that kind of borders the property on the north and on the east side, Pulpus Road, when that was put in back in the early part of the 1900s, they actually installed a bunch of pipes underneath the road that drained the surrounding wetlands and around 1,000 acres in this part of the island. And it's that whole watershed is draining into Windswept, which is a very low-lying area. Water moves through the property, and then, as I mentioned previously, there's a single culvert that exits the site, and it eventually makes its way to East and West Pulpus Harbor. And then that Pulpus Harbor is connected to Nantucket Harbor, connected to the head of the harbor, our town basin, and eventually out into Nantucket Sound. So this is all very, very much connected. And this single culvert, the water that's coming out of the single culvert is eventually making its way to all of these different places. So we wanted to gain an understanding. I wanted to spend a little, just the last couple slides explaining how restoring a freshwater wetland can improve water quality in Nantucket Harbor and Nantucket Sound. And in order to do that, I wanted to compare the way surface water flowed through this site during cranberry farming and before our wetland restoration project to how it is flowing through now. So before we did this restoration and when we were growing cranberries at the site, we had the nutrient inputs from the surrounding watershed, which I showed you a couple slides ago. The 1,000 acres were draining under Pulpus Road into the site. But we were also inputting nutrients from cranberry cultivation because, you know, we were farming organically, but organic farming is farming and organic fertilizer is fertilizer. So that was an additional source of nutrients going into the water. The landscape was very, very simplified, very flat topography with deep, very efficient drainage ditches. And basically what that did was it allowed water to move through the property very, very quickly with higher rates of flow and reduced residence time. And the reduced residence time is important because wetland plants, what they do, one of the ecosystem services that they do, is they uptake nutrients and turn it into plant biomass and incorporate it into plant tissues. But when the water is moving through the property very quickly, there isn't a lot of time to do that. So comparing that to what the conditions are like now, we still have nutrient inputs from the surrounding watershed. However, we're no longer putting any inputs in from cranberry growing. There's a lot of landscape diversity and topography that has been restored. We don't have any flat bog surfaces. We don't have any drainage ditches. We only have diffuse flow paths, and there are no rivers running through the site. So the water is essentially really slowed down compared to the way it was before when it was a cranberry bog. And that slower water flow allows the plants to uptake more nutrients. So, you know, creating natural slow movement allows the native vegetation to do what it is designed to do, uptake excess nutrients. And what that does is it improves water quality. And we have been extensively monitoring the water that's coming out of this site by doing monthly water quality samples and are in the process of analyzing all of that data. And then finally, I just wanted to explain the far future benefits to this particular restoration project at Windswept. The NOAA projections show that a portion of this site is going to be under tidal influence in 2100 if everything goes the way the models are showing, and none of us will be around to see that, but essentially Windswept is going to be a pathway for sea level rise and salt marsh migration. And that expanded acreage of low elevation wetlands adjacent to the coast will provide buffer flooding and increased resiliency going into the future. And that's all I have. I just want to give a big shout out to all of our funders and our partners. A lot of people were involved in this project, both in terms of doing the work, designing the work that we did, and then of course providing funding so that we could implement it and get the job done. So I want to give a big thanks to everyone who was involved with that. and I am very happy to take any questions that you may have.
Wow, that was awesome. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you.
Awesome. When you said before I get to a couple of the questions that I see, the decision, I think it was 2017 to retire the bogs. How,
Hmm.
how I was just curious, how long did that take as far as getting to that decision? Was that years in the making of discussing and talking and
Yeah, it was definitely years in the making. I would say that we started discussing the possibility of doing that at least 5 years before we finally pulled the trigger on it. And at the end of the day, like the two major things that really informed that decision were the water quality concerns because Nantucket Harbor is just such an important resource for Nantucket. We have one of the few remaining viable scallop industries here, and we just wanted to be doing everything we could to be helping with that situation and improving the harbor water quality. But also, growing cranberries was just becoming unfeasible from a financial perspective as well. And on top of all the challenges that cranberry growers face when they're on the mainland, we have the added cost of having to load our cranberries into a gigantic truck and then pay to get it on the steamship authority to get it off the island so that it can be processed. So it's like 10 times more expensive for us than it would, not 10 times, but a lot more expensive to do that here than it would be if you were on Cape Cod.
Got it. Okay. Um, Someone had asked, is the water totally fresh or is there some saltiness to it?
It's totally fresh right now. Yes. There is no the connection that goes from Windswept out to Nantucket Harbor it's one way in the sense that there's no tidal influence yet, but at some point in the future, as sea level rises, it's predicted that it will become salty, but that's not going to happen until 2100.
Okay. Burton asks, are you monitoring water quality in the restoration area and Pulpus Harbor?
We are not necessarily in the restoration area because we have this unique opportunity where it's just leaving the site through this one culvert. So doing water quality analyses is pretty expensive, especially when you have to send your samples off island. Overnight mail. So we're just doing it at the exit to the property, and then there are other entities such as the town of Nantucket that actively monitor Pulpus Harbor and the some of the other sites around the harbor.
Oh, okay. Megan says, could this project, the Windswept project, serve as a model for other retired bogs across Massachusetts, New England, or wherever? Have people reached out to you, or can it serve as a model for others in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to give a shout out. There's an organization called the Living Observatory, and it was put together by Gloriana Davenport, and she and her husband were the former property owners of a cranberry bog in the Plymouth area, and they made the decision to retire cranberry growing on their property and turn it into sort of an experimental laboratory where all these different parameters were being measured as they went through the restoration process. And they've put together like an amazing community of learning surrounding cranberry growing in Massachusetts. So they're the ones that are really spearheading that. And, I would say, yes, this is a model for others, but all the others were a model for us. So we're all like sharing information and learning from each other. And the restorations that happen a couple years from now will be serving as a model for new projects that will be coming online. So there's an amazing community of learning associated with this because it's kind of a very young and unique type of science. And it's been really cool to, and the take home message that I've realized from this is that every site is different. There's a lot of similarities, but there's also a lot of differences. So every time you do a project like this, you definitely learn something new, more than one thing.
I'm sure with Canada, that even brings up a whole different set of variables and variables. Just have they also they have now probably come into the mix of all of these groups that you're mentioning. And that's relatively recent, the whole Canada being, is that due to climate?
Yeah, pretty much. I think Canada realized that, we're going to have great conditions for growing cranberries now that the climate's changing, and they decided to get involved in it. Yeah, I would say that's happened over like the last 20 years or so.
Hmm.
So relatively recent.
We have a question here, Shannon Gilman. Just to clarify, the vegetation reclamation was all natural? No seeding was necessary?
Yes, in the wetlands, yes. We did in some of those deposition areas that I was talking about where we were trying to establish sampling grassland habitat. We did do some planting of natives. It was native seed collected from our property that, all native to Nantucket. And then we also, at one particular site, we had a vehicle crossing with a really steep slope, and we did do some restoration plantings on that to stabilize it. But other than that, it was all, yes, native vegetation that came in on its own from the seed bank. And I think that was the most amazing thing to me that happened. It's very cool.
The turtles, the spotted turtles, 272. Um, I know they were tracked. What have they, since have they taught you about how wildlife actually responds to habitat restoration? I'm sure they're still being monitored.
Yeah. I mean, it's we often joke about like what those turtles went into hibernation, and then they came out in the spring and look like their entire universe had been turned upside down. Like everything was different, and we often wonder like, well, if I don't know if they think or not, but what were they thinking when they came out of hibernation? Because I'm sure a lot of people know this, but turtles are very, very site specific. Like you should never move a turtle because they're very have so much site fidelity to particular locations, and you just got to wonder like what they were thinking when they came out of hibernation and found everything completely different. But they have been using the property extensively, and I can't wait for when we analyze all of this data and take a look at it, because I'm sure what we're going to see is that they're using the restored wetlands much more extensively than they were using the cranberry bogs, because in the cranberry bogs, they were really focused on kind of swimming around in the ditches. And the ditches, there weren't that many of them. There were a few, but not that many. And now the actual wetland habitat that's available to them it's the entire bog, not just the ditches within the bog, because the surface of the bog is actually kind of dry and not particularly great habitat
Hmm.
for turtles. So hopefully we've improved their habitat quite a bit.
I thought it was interesting that they all hibernated in the same place. That tells you a lot about the species, the working
Yeah.
in groups together. Were there rare or threatened species that do stand to benefit from this whole restoration?
A lot of the plants,
Okay.
yeah, a lot of rare plants that we protected and created new habitat for. We have a slender blue flag iris here that is pretty rare, and that's doing really well post restoration. So yeah.
There's we have someone here that says if the site over years does intake brackish water, how might that
Mhm.
affect the turtles and other species of animals and plants?
That's a very good question. Spotted turtles are exclusively a freshwater species. They can't survive in salt water. So my suspicion is that they would migrate inland. And fortunately, we have a lot of freshwater wetland habitat that's a little bit higher and further back from the coast. So hopefully there's a migration corridor that they can move into when and if that happens in the future. They probably don't want to because they like this. They have a lot of site fidelity, like I mentioned. But that's really important in terms of a lot of these wetlands. It's important to have adjacent protected habitat around them, because when sea level does rise, you need to have a place for species to migrate to and habitats to migrate to. So that's a good question. And as far
The
as the plants go, they'll slowly do the same thing. You know, they'll if they get inundated with salt water, there'll be a change in the habitat community and more saltwater tolerant plants will move in, and then the freshwater plants will die out.
The before and after pictures were stunning. I mean, the one you took a couple of weeks ago, you said, I mean, how happy were you to, I mean, how happy is everybody there to see what's been, the transformation
Yeah.
take place? That's pretty
Yeah,
cool.
we're all very happy. Whenever our engineers still come back and they're doing monthly surveys through this year to document how everything is changing, and every time they come, they're like, "Wow, we did this." That's yeah,
So,
it's
I
it's
mean,
gratifying. It's very gratifying, but it takes a village, and a lot of people worked really hard on this project, and we're very grateful to them.
well, we'll end with, I mean, because it does represent years of planning and science, and all the partnerships you mentioned and patience. So, I guess we'll end with, what do you think that this project says about the future of conservation on Nantucket specifically, and what gives you the most hope as you look ahead?
I think for me, like uh, doing this project was such a learning experience for me, and it was just um, it was really gratifying to see that the technology is there, that our understanding of ecological systems and how to do restoration has come so far that we can do work like this. And it's always better to not mess something up, but it's nice to know that past damage can sort of be unwound, and you can set the stage to sort of invite nature back in. And it was amazing to me how quickly that happened. Amazing.
We got one more that snuck in here. Gerhard says, "Are there other animals in the bogs besides the spotted turtles, the fish, and the birds?"
Yeah, yeah. So there are a lot of species of fish. We also have eels, and that's another interesting story. So some of those water control structures that we removed are facilitating passage of eels to get back through the bogs and into some of the freshwater ponds around the property. So that's really cool. Um, I'm trying to think of what else. Nantucket's kind of interesting in that we don't actually have a lot of the wildlife species that
Right.
you guys have on the Cape. So we don't have any like big mammals or anything other than deer and rabbits. We don't have chipmunks or fox or squirrels or things like that. We don't have otters. So, if this was to happen, if this project were to happen on Martha's Vineyard, I'm sure we would have created otter habitat, but we don't have otters.
Right.
Hmm. But birds, lots of water birds have been use the property. We've seen tons of shorebirds during migration, osprey, even eagles as they move through on migration. So it's been pretty cool.
Thank you so much. We're going to get this up. This is being recorded for people who might want to share it or view it. Thank you, Karen, so much. I appreciate it. Hope everybody else did. And just for everyone here, we do have two more. Speaking of Osprey, that you just mentioned,
Mm.
our next webinar, September 17th. Osprey is on the Cape and Islands. We have former Nat Geo host and New York Times bestselling author David Gessner. And for that, for the people that are watching and listening, I just finished this a few weeks ago. It's celebrating its 25th anniversary, Return of the Osprey, that David wrote. I will say this, you feel like you're in the marshes with him as he follows various osprey nests around the Cape. It's part memoir, now I feel like I'm an expert on osprey. So go register for that. That's for September 17th. And then as we're hitting the winter in November, can't believe I'm saying that, but November 12th, we have naturalist John Hanlon, and we'll be going over winter birds on Nantucket Sound. And should you have any questions at all about anything Nantucket Sound or our webinar series, or would like to relay a question to Karen about something that you may not have asked or think about later, please reach out to me at peter@saveoursound.org, but also our president and CEO if you have anything that you'd like to say to Audra, who's not here tonight, but definitely give a shout out there if you'd like to get in touch with us. There's our phone number, our website, where you can register for the webinars and see all the other past webinars, and Audra's email as well. So that's it. Thank you, Karen. And to everybody, Karen, and to everybody out there, have a great rest of your summer and stay safe. And thank you so much. Bye, Karen.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation and for listening. I appreciate it. Enjoy
You're
your night.
welcome. Thanks, Karen. Bye bye.
Bye.